Managing editor Rahul Kanwal joins us live from Melbourne at this juncture. Rahul, what has been the response to Modi's speech at the Sydney Olympic Park?
Prime Minister Narendra Modi's speech at the Sydney Olympic Park Arena has received a very strong response from the Australian media. I want to show you first the Sydney Morning Herald. We're in Melbourne, so I don't have a copy of the paper, but the Sydney Morning Herald says Indian Prime Minister rocks arena. It talks about how there was a massive Indian-style carnival, which even Australian leaders cannot put together. It talks about how both countries are cooperating in the area of coal, energy security. And this is on the front page. Narendra Modi on the front page, half-page splash banner display on the Sydney Morning Herald. Let me now come to the Australian. The other big Australian newspaper, it's called The Australian. This one, while it has Xi Jinping and Tony Abbott on the front page, there is a big story about Narendra Modi, and it says here, a nation's master holds the masses in his spell. A nation's master holds the masses in his spell. And it's very interesting because the newspaper writes that Narendra Modi got a reception that Barack Obama can only wish for these days. It goes on to say that even Katy Perry, who plays at the Allphones Arena for several days after the Prime Minister, would be jealous of Modi's rock star welcome. It talks about how President Obama is now a politician whose star is on the decline. He no longer has the kind of support he did earlier. And it talks of how Modi, 6 months into his prime ministership, is still hugely popular with the Indian diaspora here in Australia.
Well, that's what the Australian press is saying, Rahul. But what's the response to the Prime Minister's speech at Canberra? And what plans for Melbourne today?
The Prime Minister delivered a very well-received speech at the joint session of Parliament in Canberra. He's become the first Indian Prime Minister to have been invited to speak to a joint session of Parliament. What's very interesting is that today both the Chinese President Xi Jinping and the Indian Prime Minister are being hosted by their Australian counterparts. So Tony Abbott has actually had a tough time. He was with Modi in the morning. He quickly went for an event with Xi Jinping. Now he's back to Melbourne for an event with Prime Minister Modi. So he's got these two big world leaders he has to juggle with, and he's doing a good job, frankly. But the Prime Minister spoke about the joint ties between India and Australia, about taking this relationship further, about how it's a relationship with a lot of convergence and very little divergence. 5 key agreements on tourism, trade, energy security were signed, and an effort is being made to try and push the India-Australia relationship further and faster. The Prime Minister has now reached Melbourne, where this afternoon he'll be at the Melbourne cricket ground, and there's a big reception being planned where cricket legends from India and Australia will both participate, and that will be the Prime Minister's last event in Australia before he heads off for Fiji.
Appreciate you joining us, Rahul Kanwal, managing editor, reporting right now from Melbourne. He'll be reporting and getting us the very latest through the course of the day. But taking off from what Rahul was saying on how the Australian media is covering the Indian Prime Minister's visit, I'd like to cut across to my colleague Sana, who's standing by, going to take us through once again how the Australian media is covering the Indian Prime Minister's visit.
Now, it's the last few hours of Prime Minister Narendra Modi's visit in Australia, but the media over there is abuzz with news about the Indian Prime Minister and what he said at his address to the Parliament over there. Let's take a look at some of the major publications in Australia. The Sydney Morning Herald goes on to say that Modi and Abbott reveal the new India-Australia military agreement. It goes on to show this big, bold picture of the Prime Minister with Tony Abbott and talks about how India and Australia have entered a new era of security and military cooperation based on shared values and aimed at defending a rules-based international order. Now, what's more crucial is that it goes on to mention how this deal that has come after the Chinese president has flown from Canberra to Tasmania. Remember, we are talking about this region where China is a very big player, also coming very close after the Chinese incursions. Another publication, the Sydney Morning Herald, in fact, in another article, gives out this whole video of how, Prime Minister Narendra Modi is completely at ease with Tony Abbott. And here's another picture of the Prime Minister doing a namaste to all the dignitaries present in the Australian Parliament. You can see how the time is coded. So minute by minute details, the Australian media is keeping an eye on all that's happening as far as Narendra Modi is concerned. Now, very interestingly, if you take a closer look at this, the point that I'm highlighting over here, it's the Australian media recognizes that it's not very commonly that Narendra Modi addresses in English, but this time he spoke in English, and that's very crucial. Australian media appreciated that fact. Look at the headline over here of this another publication, the Herald Sun. It says Indian Prime Minister Modi addresses joint sitting of the Federal Parliament, goes on to give the whole video of that address. And look at this, look at this. This was really fun when the Prime Minister said that, look, Mr. Abbott, this is a way of shirt fronting you. Now, shirt fronting, let's tell you, is a very less used diplomatic term, which essentially means that you invite a foreign dignitary to your own country and then you get him to do, the real work, something that was not on the agenda, but you get the leader to come and talk real business with you. So that was, of course, mentioned in a very lighter tone, and the whole parliament, in fact, burst out in laughter with that. Now, lastly, Brisbane Times. Even after Prime Minister Modi left Brisbane Times is very enthusiastically covering all aspects of Prime Minister Narendra Modi's visit. It talks about the Security Cooperation Pact signed between India and Australia, goes on to give the details, also mentioning the Chinese president's absence at the time the deal was signed.